The Travan soldiers had never seen a human refuse to run. Everyone ran during raids. Sirens, red lights, the floor shaking. The formula worked because living things scattered when it was applied. Predictable. Clean. The Travan had run hundreds of raids, and the formula never missed. Nora Cole did not scatter. She was in her workshop on the lower deck of Outpost KL-7 when the first explosion hit the walls. Tools clattered off the table. The lights cut to emergency red. She picked them up and put them back. Then she turned to the device clamped in front of her. Almost done. The casing was a dark composite band, wide enough to cover her wrist and ordinary enough that no one had looked at it twice in 3 months of wearing it. Half the station crew wore something similar. She had counted on that from the start. She seated the last wire, pressed the panel closed, and strapped it to her left wrist. Held the button just long enough to feel the pulse respond. Half a second of vibration. Then quiet. She grabbed her data drive and walked toward the exit. For Travan soldiers were already at the far end of the corridor. Tall, gray-skinned, full combat frames, weapons up. She stopped. They looked at each other. She was standing with her hands at her sides, watching them the way you watch weather that is already coming and cannot be redirected. One of them gestured. She raised her hands, let them pull the data drive from her grip. They scanned her twice, logged her, and never touched the wristband. It looked like standard monitoring equipment. They had no reason to think otherwise. On the warship, processing moved fast. A Travan officer stamped her as low risk without a long look. Humans were always low risk. Everyone in the Dominion knew that. Then came the Shackles. She had read the technical documents. In person, they looked smaller than expected. 4 flat bands of dark metal, 2 for the wrists and 2 for the ankles. A soldier locked each one in sequence. The last click. The field activated slowly, which was worse than a sudden hit would have been. Pressure from all directions, like the air was thickening around her muscles and drawing tight. Her shoulders dropped under it. Just pulling in a full breath took some effort. She kept her face still. A senior officer entered the processing room. Older than the soldiers, broader, wearing a rank band that said he had stopped having to ask for things a long time ago. He looked at her for 4 or 5 seconds, the kind of look that had already made up its mind before it started. Species. Human. Field researcher. A fraction less interested. Block 3. He left before she was even moved. The cell was transparent and bare. Shelf on one wall, ventilation unit overhead, smooth floor. Door sealed behind her. She sat down with care. Every shift of weight carried an extra charge under the field, the gravity pulling harder the moment she tried to do anything. She breathed slowly and let her body accept the load instead of fighting it. Then she listened. The Shackles had a sound. Faint, high-pitched, sitting right at the edge of what ears could catch. Most people would not notice it unless they were already hunting for it. She had been hunting for that exact pitch for 14 months. The first time she documented the Travan gravity emitter frequency was from a wrecked probe the assembly had cleared for human research access. Her colleagues focused on the power source. She stayed on the frequency. 7.4 gigahertz. Narrow band. Continuous output. The shackles on her wrists hummed at exactly that number. She found the button on the wristband with her thumb. One press. Half a second. Not yet. She needed the ship's layout first. Where communications were. How many crew ran the night watch? How long until Dominion space? She folded her hands in her lap and let the hum settle into the background around her. 14 months of work had come down to this room. A few more days was a small price. The guard who came to check on her the next morning was young. She could tell from the way he moved, careful and precise, the posture of someone still working to prove they belonged somewhere. He stopped outside her cell, checked the containment panel, checked it again, then looked at her like he was not entirely sure what a human was supposed to do when left alone overnight. "Is there any water?" she asked. He blinked, walked away, came back with a container of clear fluid, and passed it through the slot without speaking. She drank it slowly. Flat but clean. "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment. Then, in careful assembly standard, "You are not frightened." "I am," she said. "I am also just very tired." That seemed to land somewhere reasonable. He stayed by the door, not quite leaving, not quite starting anything. She let the silence sit. Then asked small things. How long the watch rotation ran, whether the ship kept Travan time or assembly standard, whether the food provisions included anything a human could actually process. He answered in short sentences. His name was Yoon. 18 months into his first posting. He had not said any of that directly. She built it from the details he mentioned without meaning to. The warship ran on Traven cycle for long shifts, reduced crew through the dark hours. Her cell block was on Deck 7. Every transition between decks needed clearance. He mentioned during a quiet stretch that a systems check had been scheduled for the communications equipment on Deck 6, one level below where she was sitting. She did not follow up on that. On the afternoon of the second day, Yoon went quieter than usual. He stood by the door and stared at the far wall like he was working through something he had not expected to be working through. She waited. "What were you researching?" he said. "On the station. Traven propulsion systems. Field containment in older probe cores." He frowned. "Why would humans study that?" "We find things interesting," she said. "That is mostly what we do." He was quiet. Then, "Admiral Drask says humans are far behind technologically. He is not wrong that we came into galactic contact late," she said. Yin heard the gap in that. He was sharp enough for it. He glanced at her sideways. "But," he said. She smiled at him. "No but. Just an observation." He left when his rotation ended. At the door, he paused half a second longer than necessary. Something in the set of his shoulders looked unsettled before the corridor took him. She filed it away and turned back to the wristband. The counter-frequency pulse was preloaded. The target frequency matched the hum she had been living with for 2 days now. She could pick it out from the ship's background noise without trying. 7.4 gigahertz. What she still needed was confirmation of whether the field ran a compensating secondary system. If it did, the pulse duration might need adjusting. The easiest way to get that answer was to hear the shackle architecture described by the person who designed it. Engineers who build something they are proud of tend to explain it, especially when someone is wearing it and failing to break it on schedule. She leaned back against the cell wall and closed her eyes. Her shoulders were sore. Her breathing stayed shallow under the field no matter how slowly she tried to breathe, never quite reaching the bottom of her lungs. She had stopped hoping that would improve. Night cycle in a few hours. Interrogation tomorrow, most likely. After that, or maybe before, whoever designed the shackles would want to look at the prisoner who had not collapsed the way prisoners were supposed to collapse. All she had to do was sit still and wait for it. She was good at sitting still. She had practiced it her entire career, in research stations and conference rooms, and assembly hearings where humans were the youngest species in the room, and everyone else was watching to see how they handled that. She had learned a long time ago that patience, applied consistently, was more useful than almost anything else she owned. Tonight it would be useful again. The interrogation room had no chairs. Nora noticed it the moment the soldiers brought her in. It was a clean piece of design. The gravity shackles already made standing difficult, and lowering herself to the floor would look like surrender. Keeping prisoners on their feet in a room with nothing to lean on was simple and effective. She appreciated the logic of it while her shoulders argued about it. Admiral Drask stood across from her with his hands behind his back. Up close, he was quieter than she had expected. Not calm exactly, but controlled in the way of someone who had learned that loudness was unnecessary when you already held all the cards. He looked at her without speaking for a moment. Then, Human Fleet Staging Point 7. Outer Rim. Give me the coordinates. I am a field researcher, she said. I do not have military positioning data. You hold assembly research clearance and you operated on a station at the edge of a contested sector. You know things. I know Traven probe drive mechanics, she said. Propulsion field tolerances in second-generation cores. Emission variance between your older models and your current generation. Fleet coordinates are not in my professional domain. Drask looked at her steadily. You are not afraid. I know my rights under Assembly Treaty Protocol, she said. That helps. This is not an assembly proceeding. I know that too, she said. He asked 3 more questions. She gave answers that were technically accurate and entirely useless to him. He knew it. She knew he knew it. He showed no frustration, which told her this was not the real interrogation, just the first pass. He would come back. He left without another word. A different Traven entered shortly after. Shorter, quicker, with the efficient movements of someone who found most situations slightly beneath his attention. He carried a data pad and wore an expression of permanent mild irritation. He introduced himself as Fel. He was responsible for the restraint systems aboard the warship and had been asked to verify the shackles were calibrated correctly, given that she appeared more physically functional than typical prisoners at this stage of confinement. Then he started talking about the shackles. She let him. He described the gravity anchor distribution across all 4 bands with obvious pride. The compensating architecture. If any single band was physically destroyed, the remaining 3 increased output automatically and held the full field load without interruption. The secondary power cell that activated within 0.3 of a second if the main emitter was ever disrupted. He spoke about it with the enthusiasm of someone who had spent years on a problem and was glad someone was finally paying attention. She listened and kept her expression quiet and faintly interested. When he paused, she asked, as if the thought had just occurred to her. The field is continuous? No reset cycle. Perfectly continuous, he said. No cycle. No gap. What about signal interference? From other equipment on the ship, does the emitter band have sensitivity to competing frequencies? Something shifted in his face. Not much. A small tightening around the eyes. The architecture is hardened against external signals, he said. Standard protocol. Of course, she said. He paused. Then, more careful than before, what exactly is your field of study? Propulsion systems. Old probe cores. Nothing classified. He looked at her wrist. She held her breathing steady. The wristband sat where it had always sat. Dark composite material, 1 small button, unremarkable. He looked at it for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then he looked back at her face and said, with the tone of someone closing a question they had decided not to pursue, "The shackles are performing correctly." He turned and left. She was walked back to her cell. Yin secured the door and stood by the wall. His posture had changed. He was watching her with more attention now. The way you watch something you are no longer sure you have correctly understood. She sat on the shelf and turned over what Fel had told her. Hardened against external signals. External. That word was doing a lot of work in his design. A signal originating from outside the field boundary. Yes, the architecture could reject that. But a counter-frequency pulse generated from inside the field, from a device already sitting beneath the emitter band, was not external. It was inside the architecture. It did not need to fight the hardening. It just had to speak at the right frequency. She looked over at Yun. How long until night cycle? He checked the wall panel. 4 hours. She nodded. Thank you. She folded her hands, closed her eyes, and let herself breathe. 4 hours. Fine. She had waited 14 months to reach this room. 4 more hours was nothing she could not manage. 3 hours into night cycle, the warship went quiet in the way ships only went quiet when they believed nothing was going to happen. The overhead lights in her cell had dropped to a low amber. The ventilation system changed pitch when the active crew count fell. Footsteps in the corridor outside had thinned out, then stopped. Yin was still at his post. She could hear him shifting his weight every few minutes. The small, irregular sounds of someone fighting sleep and not winning. Nora had not moved in 3 hours. The gravity shackles had been active for 72 hours. Her whole upper body carried a dull, settled ache, the kind that stopped announcing itself and just became part of the background. Her lungs worked short under the field, the way they had for 3 days, never dangerous, just never full, never quite reaching the bottom. She looked at the wristband on her left wrist. The shackle band sat directly over it. That positioning was the part she had planned most carefully. Standard biometric monitors sat below the natural wrist line. Traven shackle bands locked at the wrist's widest point. The geometry had worked out exactly as she had calculated it would. She moved her thumb to the side of the band and found the button. Small. Flat. Easy to miss if you were not looking. She went through the math one final time. 7.4 GHz target. Counter pulse width set to narrow band. Duration, half a second. The pulse would not destroy the field emitter or damage the bands. It would send a signal through the system that the gravity anchor would read as a shutdown confirmation. It would tell the shackles they were already off. She pressed the button. The hum stopped. The weight left her body all at once. Not gradually, not fading, just gone. She sat completely still for a moment and did not quite trust it. Then she inhaled. All the way down. She had not breathed like that in 3 days. She sat with that for a moment before she let it out. She stood up. No resistance. Her spine straightened on its own and gave a long, slow series of cracks as the compression released. She rolled her left shoulder, then her right. She turned her neck. She stretched both arms overhead. The shackle bands were still locked on her wrists and ankles. The metal had not moved. The status lights still blinked green. But the field was gone and the hum was gone. She was standing free in the middle of a maximum security Traven holding cell. She looked up at the surveillance lens in the upper corner of the room. In the monitoring station one corridor over, Yin was awake. He was staring at the feed for cell block 3, section 1. Nothing on his board had changed. The containment indicators showed the field active. The power readings were completely normal. The screen showed a human woman standing in the center of her cell, rolling her shoulders. He reached for the alert panel. He held his hand there and did not press it. 17 seconds later, the automated system caught the movement discrepancy and the alarm triggered on its own. The sound went through every corridor at once. Doors opened across the decks. Boots on metal in rapid sequence. Fast, clipped Traven voices carrying through the walls. In his quarters, Admiral Drask sat up at the first tone. An officer appeared at his door with a data slate. Drask looked at the surveillance image. The cell block feed showed a human woman standing without restriction in a locked maximum security cell, the shackle indicators in the corner of the frame reading active and normal. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at the timestamp. She had been standing freely for 17 seconds before the alarm caught it. He still said nothing. 3 decks away, a priority signal reached Fel. He was in the monitoring room within minutes, standing in front of the main display. He pulled up the recorded footage and watched her press something on her wrist. Half a second. Then the field indicators stayed green, and she simply stood up. He ran it back, watched it again, then twice more at half speed, looking for the moment where his system had failed. There was no moment. The indicators said the shackles were running. The screen said a human was stretching her arms above her head. Both things were true, at the same time, on the same feed. He had spent 11 years building a system that had never been defeated. He stood in silence while the alarm rang through the ship and had no explanation to offer anyone, including himself. Nora was not running when the soldiers arrived. She stood in the center of the cell with her hands visible at her sides. She had considered moving before they came. The door had no mechanism she could operate, and running would have confirmed exactly what they feared, that she was more capable than she had appeared. She was not ready to confirm everything yet. The door opened hard. For soldiers, moving fast. They stopped when they saw her standing still, hands clear, nothing in them, making no move. She could see the confusion in how they held their weapons. They had come in for a serious problem. She was just a human woman standing quietly in the middle of her cell. "I am not resisting," she said. "I would like to speak with Yun." The soldiers looked at each other. Yun appeared in the doorway behind them. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully place, something caught between afraid and working hard not to show it. His posture was stiffer than usual. "You need to come with us," he said. "I will," she said. "I am ready." They processed her in the corridor. New restraints, manual locking cuffs stacked on top of the existing shackle bands. A second full sensor sweep. A Traven officer ran a hand scanner over the wristband twice and logged it as a standard biometric monitor. She let them do all of it without a word. They moved her to a secured room on Deck 5 while the command team assembled. She used the walk. The route from the cell block to the stairwell down to 5, the distance between each guard position in the amber-lit corridors. She tracked the patrol timing, counted crew she saw in the half-staffed last stretch of night cycle. Deck 6 was one level below where she now stood, and the ship was beginning to come back to full staffing. She needed to move before it did. Drask arrived with 2 senior officers and stood in front of her without preamble. "How?" he said. "Counter-frequency pulse," she said. "Narrow band. Half-second duration." He looked at her shackles, then at her face. That would require a device calibrated to the exact emitter frequency of the bands. "Yes," she said. "You built that. In my workshop, before your soldiers came through the door." He looked at the wristband. "Take it," he said. A soldier unclipped it from her wrist. Drask turned it over in his hands. It looked exactly like what it had always looked like, dark composite material, one small flush button on the side, a faint status light. He handed it to Fel, who had arrived behind the group. Fel held it the way someone holds something that has personally embarrassed them. He turned it over twice. He pressed the button. Nothing happened. The pulse had been a single charge, and it was spent. He said nothing. Drask moved her to a secondary holding space on deck 5. One entry point. No transparent wall. Heavier door. He did not speak to her again before he left. She sat in the new room and waited. 2 hours passed. The corridor outside went quiet. Then one set of careful footsteps arrived and stopped at the door. Yin stepped in. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. "You are going to try to reach communications," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He was quiet. "Deck 6, he said. "Secondary bay, less monitoring than the primary room." She looked at him. He held the look for a moment, then stepped out of the doorway and held the door open from the outside, his back to the corridor. She stood up and walked out. They went through the stairwell together without speaking. He checked each corner before she turned into it. She stayed close and matched his pace exactly. Nobody runs in a prisoner transfer. That was the logic. Walk with purpose, walk with the right spacing, and it reads as routine. It worked on 3 different crew members they passed on the way down. Deck 6. The secondary communications bay had one technician on duty. He was asleep at his station with his head on his forearm. Yin stayed at the doorway. Nora moved to the panel. Her wrists were still in the manual cuffs. She worked around them. She had run the sequence in her head enough times that the actual task took under 90 seconds. Outbound channel, compressed burst format. Everything she had memorized loaded in. Her location, the warship's heading, and 14 months of research from Outpost KL-7 that she had committed to memory the night before the raid. She sent it. Stepped back. Stood still. Yin came in and stood beside her. 3 minutes later, the soldiers appeared at the doorway at speed. Nora raised her hands and said nothing. Behind the soldiers, Admiral Drask arrived. He looked at the transmission panel, then at her. She said, "I did not break the shackles. I just asked them to stop." He looked at her for a long time. He had no answer for that. Drask did not speak to her for the first 90 minutes after the breach. He had her brought to the main command deck and placed under guard in the far corner. No seat. She sat on the floor because it was more comfortable than standing, and because she had stopped caring what anything looked like. The manual restraints were tight. Her shoulders still carried 3 days of gravity field ache. None of it mattered now. The message was gone. She watched the command deck without appearing to watch it. Drask stood at the main display table with 2 senior officers. She could not hear them from across the room, but she could read the display. New trajectory lines, 3 of them, the ship moving fast. They had changed course. Too late, she suspected. The compressed burst she had sent was designed to reach human intelligence channels in hours. She had built the transmission format herself, in the same workshop where she had built the wristband, knowing that if she ever ended up on a Travan warship, she would need to be efficient. She had hoped it would never be necessary. She had built it anyway. After 80 minutes, the floor vibrated. Not a collision. A drive resonance from a nearby ship dropping out of transit. She had spent enough time near human vessels to recognize the frequency pattern. It was different from Travan drives in a way that was hard to describe, but unmistakable once you knew it. That was a human ship. Across the command deck, the crew registered the contact at the same moment she did. The controlled urgency of the past 2 hours sharpened into something else. Drask turned from the display table and looked at her. She did not look away. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her. She did not stand. There was no performance left to give. "You transmitted a location signal," he said. "And my research," she said. 14 months of it. All memorized. I was not sure I would have access to my data drive, so I committed it to memory the night before the raid." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her the way you look at a calculation that has come out to a number you cannot account for. "You memorized 14 months of technical research. Most of it is pattern recognition," she said. "Humans are reasonably good at that. How long have humans been studying Travan technology?" "Since the first year of galactic contact," she said. He said nothing. She said, "Every species in the assembly assumed we were too far behind to understand what we were looking at. We understood most of it from the beginning. We chose not to say so while we were still filling in the gaps. The extraction was fast after that. The assembly had been contacted through diplomatic channels before the human ships finished dropping out of transit. The situation was categorized formally as a treaty violation. Travan forces detaining an assembly-cleared researcher without grounds or notification. The Travan ships in the sector moved in. The human ships held position. Nobody fired. Drask handed her over in the docking corridor wearing the expression of someone who had already decided how they were going to carry this moment. He said nothing when she walked past him. She said nothing either. There was nothing left to say that the situation had not already said. On the assembly vessel, she got water and food and a seat that did not press on her from every direction. A human officer sat across from her with a recording slate. She described the past 5 days, clearly and in full. The account moved fast once it left that room. By the time she had eaten and slept and changed her clothes, every species council in the assembly had received a briefing. A human researcher, restrained with the most advanced gravity shackles in the Travan Dominion, had defeated them with one press of a device she built herself. Then she had transmitted a full year of classified research from memory before accepting recapture without incident. The Travan Dominion released a public statement. Fell described the escape as an unforeseen hardware interaction producing a brief operational anomaly. Nobody with any technical knowledge believed him. Drask released no statement. A journalist from the Assembly Public Record Service asked Nora if she had anything she wanted to say. She thought about it. Then she said, "We have been watching this galaxy very carefully since we arrived. We did not say much because we were still learning. We are done learning now." Those 2 sentences spread across the assembly fast. Species councils, military planning rooms, research institutions, everyone read them and then read them again, working out what they implied about the 40 years that came before them. In the Travan Dominion, a full internal audit was ordered. Every record of human access to Travan technology across the past 4 decades pulled and reviewed, cleared research permits, shared observation programs, assembly sanctioned station access, joint study agreements that nobody had looked at closely because humans were too primitive for any of it to matter. Drask received the summary report 3 days later. He read it alone in his quarters, and when he set it down he sat in silence for a long time. The scope of what humans had quietly understood, while every species in the Dominion looked past them, was far wider than anyone had estimated. Far wider than he had feared.